of technique must start earlier. When I was small, we didn't have English class until last year of the um, um, last year of primary school. I don't
Uh-huh.
sure. I'm not sure. I almost a teenager. I started English, and my English teacher, I should say, um, it's not like right now teachers. They don't teach the same way.
Ah, yes. I had problems with that in high school and elementary school too, where um, my my French teachers were terrible. I studied French 5.5 years, but 2.5 years in high school, and when I got to college, they gave me one semester. I was required to complete 3 years of college French, and so I had to basically start over again. and and so those things happen. Okay, so I've got us onto YouTube here, and we have 4 folks watching. So what I'm doing today, this morning, my time, is I'm continuing on with a lecture, or I'm sorry, an essay that was written by Thomas Arzt in this book, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, um, edited by Murray Stein and Thomas Arzt. And sadly, Thomas Arzt died on April the 12th. That was Easter Sunday of this year. Um, and so, in part, as a memoriam to him, I am reading the first essay in the series. There are now 4 books in this series. I'm reading the first essay and commenting on it. It's a fairly long essay, and last week I managed to get through a page and a half in the discussion. I'm going to back up just a little bit, um, just to bring context about the importance of the individual. So I'm on page 21 of this essay, and it says, since the archetypal world cannot be suppressed without substantial consequences, and since contemporary society and culture are not able to tackle the actual problems, let alone draw up feasible solutions, it is the individual that ultimately has to face this conflict. Sensible, sensitive, even deranged contemporaries once again have to restore the spiritual anchorage that has been undercut by most postmodern categories of interpretation, leading to the ensuing psychological crisis. Now, the psychological crisis Dr. Arzt is referring to in that segment is um, the crisis of the 20th century that led to 280 million people being killed. Um, and so I'm just going to read one paragraph from Man and His Symbols. Uh, this is Dr. Jung's book, which he wrote as, as a book for um, individuals. And as you see, the cover of it has a tanka on the cover of this book, um, of the hardbound book. It's called Man and His Symbols. In the hardbound book, this quote comes on page 101, and I'll just read it to you. As any change must begin somewhere, it is the single individual who will experience it and carry it through. The change must indeed begin with an individual. It might be any one of us. Nobody can afford to look around and to wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself. But since nobody seems to know what to do, it might be worthwhile for each of us to ask himself, whether by any chance his or her unconscious may know something that that will help us. Certainly the conscious mind seems unable to do anything useful in this respect. Man today is painfully aware of the fact that neither his great religions nor his various philosophies seem to provide him with those powerful animating ideas that would give him the security he needs in face of the present conditions of the world. And so this example, or this comment, is being reflected in this very session, because I'm intentionally doing it at 8 o'clock in the morning, my time, so that it can be viewed live in the other part of in another part of the world, in a country that I will not mention here for good reason. And because people living in that country cannot see YouTube replays, but they can see live Zoom conferences, I'm broadcasting this live. And so I'm going to continue on with this essay now. And so I'm on page 21, and really this is the last paragraph in a major part of this essay. So it's sort of the summation of everything that we were talking about the last 3 weeks. The challenge today, therefore, is on the one hand, not to discard our Christian tradition and heritage, and on the other hand, to face up to the fact, or to the state of...
I'm sorry, I didn't follow up. Which page with patient?
Page 21 at the bottom.
21. At the bottom, so that's the patient. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Yeah. So I'll just start it again. The challenge today, therefore, is on the one hand, not to discard our Christian tradition and heritage, and on the other hand, to face up to the state of Negredo into which we have descended. Now, Negredo is a Latin term. It means the blackness, and it's a reference to medieval alchemy, in which the medieval alchemists of Europe saw one stage of the process that they were working with as a very dark time. And keeping in mind that although alchemy is known as creating gold from lead, that's not really what it was about at all. It certainly in the process, the alchemists were doing experiments that led to the modern science of chemistry, because they were trying to figure out what spirit was in matter. Okay, and you know, the spirit in matter would be something like a magnet, where two magnets held in one way force each other apart, but held the other way come together. And so that magnetism, so-called, is the spirit in that matter. And so they were looking for examples of that in all parts of matter in the medieval times. And they thought it was God's will. And so the gold they were looking for wasn't physical gold, not gold that we know now as an element, but it is spiritual gold. It's gold of the unconscious. That's what they were really looking for. And so it so happened that they developed in the process the whole science of chemistry because they sort of backed into it. But anyway, so anyway, Negredo is a period of in the process of working with chemicals and matter where things look very black, and therefore it's called Negredo. And so, but it's really a psychological idea of depression. Think of it as depression, or you know, not feeling very strong about your life at a given time. That's a Negredo from a psychological point of view. So, so I'll read that sentence again and then I'll go on. The challenge today, therefore, is on the one hand, not to discard our Christian tradition and heritage, and on the other hand, to face up to the state of Negredo into which we have descended. In Jung's view, we are standing at the beginning of a new psychological culture and era, one still, however, without collective guiding images, symbols, rituals, or myths. So what Dr. Jung was saying is that in order to move populations forward, you have to have one symbol or myth or whatever it is that everybody can follow happily. And so in the case of China, for 50 or 60 years, it was the great leader Mao Zedong. He was the symbol of what China was trying to do, and at that time, and therefore the collective of China followed him. Now, after his death, things have changed, and they've changed all over the world. In the United States, we have a president who was our leader, but unfortunately that president doesn't stack up very well to our vision of what a leader should be. And so, or at least half of us think that way. And so we have a disintegration of the collective, and we have to find a new future, a new thing to think about. And so last week, as I was talking about this, I was saying that, you know, in the Middle Ages, people had a goal and a vision of completing a cathedral. And that was, you know, for God. And it took 3 generations typically to build a cathedral. So people were each putting their brick in the cathedral, but many of the people who were building on it never saw it completed. But it gave meaning to their lives to be a participant in the process of building the cathedral. Well, nowadays we have a different collective project as a species. Our collective project as a species is to save our leaky lifeboat, because while it might be true that some human beings might be able to live on another planet one day, most of us won't. And so we're all confined to the earth, which is our leaky lifeboat. And in order for us to have a common goal, that common goal might well be to find ways to save our planet from destruction, because if it's destroyed one way or another, either by the actions of man or by the actions of God, or by the actions of interstellar comets flying around, if it's destroyed, then we all die. And so we need to find a way to keep our lifeboat going as long as we can. I mean, we know that ultimately our planet will die in 1 to 4 billion years, depending on who you ask, but we probably still have at least 1 billion years to figure it out. And so how to move away. And if we manage to make Mars useful, then maybe that can give us another 500 million years. But ultimately, our species, in order to survive, is going to have to find a place to live outside of the current solar system, which will die in about 4.5 billion years. And so the meaningful project for all of us probably is finding a way to keep this leaky lifeboat going so that we can have a life otherwise. Okay, so going on. Entering uncharted territory within the new culture goes hand in hand with the following prerequisite developments already underway. New integration efforts concerning the inclusion of evil within the understanding of wholeness, as well as the unsightly and banal. Integration of the feminine and nature is significant dimensions repressed and neglected by Christianity. Reinterpretation of religious scriptures as poetic and symbolic rather than as purely historic and literal. Interpretation of the figure of Christ as a symbolic expression of the inner dynamics of the soul. Okay, that's a very complicated sentence. Sorry, complicated sentence. So let me go back and take it apart because it's hard to listen to. All right, so the first part of this sentence, entering uncharted territory within this new culture goes hand in hand with the following prerequisite developments already underway. Okay, so many of the developments that we're talking about are already happening in the collective. There are many individuals who are taking action and doing things, and they need to be encouraged, and new individuals who see what they can do, what is their piece of the puzzle will be. And so that's what this video is. This is my piece of the puzzle. I don't expect anybody to become as knowledgeable as me on Jungian psychology. It's taken quite a long time to get to where I am, but so this is my piece of the puzzle, and I'm trying to share some of the things that I've learned from that on this YouTube channel. But everybody can find a piece of the puzzle and put it in place. And so that's what we all need to be thinking about. So the processes are underway. So the first is new integration efforts concerning the inclusion of evil within the understanding of wholeness, as well as the unsightly and the banal. Okay, so the point is that we have to face up to the fact that we're not so very pure as human beings. There's many aspects of our lives that are not terribly pretty. And just the way we live is not very clean in many ways, but we have to all recognize that these are our shortcomings and work on ways to get them better. And we have to understand our evil as the other side of good. So if I take my trash from my kitchen or my garbage from my kitchen out into a box outside my house where it gets trucked away, that is, I'm cleaning up my space. That's all well and good. But the problem is that that garbage then gets taken to a landfill where it gets thrown in with a lot of other people's garbage, and it's quite impure and it's quite toxic. And and so that part, that's kind of an evil on that part of the earth. And so we have to think consciously about what we're doing. And so recycling is one thing. You know, in point of fact, everything is recycled all the time. Okay, there's nothing in the world that is not recycled, and at different speeds. But some things we can go more easily on our resources if we reuse them in some way. And so I once had a front porch of my house which was made of old plastic milk bottles. The milk bottles had been ground up, melted down, and made into boards. And so that was a recycling of those plastic milk bottles. And at sometime in the future, when that porch collapses, inevitably, sometime in the next 100 years, perhaps, then those boards can be recycled again and they made into something new. And so that's conscious recycling. That's the kind of recycling that we think of when we do our trash every day. But in point of fact, everything, including us, is recycled. And, you know, planets themselves are recycled. And so we need to integrate that idea and then see where we can help our planet by not destroying it. So one of the ways of doing that is recycling, because then we don't need so many natural resources to pull from the planet. And so we have to understand that that's wholeness. That's part of our lives, that we are recycling to save our planet, but we're also recycling because everything recycles. So if we understand that, we're more whole. If we ignore it, if we just put the trash out and walk away from it, then we're not integrating it into our lives and understanding what it does for us, and what short-term recycling does for us. Okay, so that's referring to the unsightly and the banal. Okay, obviously, if you went for 3 weeks without taking the trash out, your house would become very unsightly and banal very quickly. So then integration of the feminine and nature as significant dimensions repressed and neglected by Christianity. So Christianity is a patriarchal religion. Many religions are patriarchal, and women have not had a chance to put their ideas into the system as much as men have. And the problem is that if we don't use women's intelligence too, then we're giving up half the brain power of our country. So, for example, in a Muslim country where women are held back very severely, they're basically giving up half of the brain power of their country, and it keeps them behind. And so, for example, Saudi Arabia is quite lucky because it has oil. And so they don't have to pay attention. They don't have to think much to get that oil out. It's a very specific thing, and they can live on that for a period of time. But at some point in the future, perhaps 200 years in the future, 250 years, when that oil runs out, they're going to be able to have to think through the fact that they live on a very hot desert, far from everything else. And so how do they keep their country going after the oil runs out? That's a big issue. And so gradually now they're starting to get the idea that they need to educate women and use them in special ways. For example, I was able to work in Saudi Arabia for many years, about 15 years, because all medicine is done in English. Now, why is the medicine in a hospital in Saudi Arabia done in English? That's a good question. The reason is that the Saudis were not allowing their women to become nurses or doctors. And so the result was that in order to have nurses, especially, they had to bring them in from India or the Philippines or the US, UK, Canada, Australia, or New Zealand. Most of them came from India or the Philippines. And so in order for the doctors in Saudi Arabia to be able to communicate with the nursing staff, the doctors had to do it in English, and the nurses had to understand what the doctors were saying in English. So that's a reality check. And so we have to, but in about 2005, then Saudi Arabia did open a nursing school for women. And so they're gradually now integrating the fact that they need women in their workforce who are Saudis, not only foreign women. And the other silly thing about Saudi Arabia was that Saudi Arabia is the world's second largest market for Victoria's Secret, which seems weird, but nonetheless it's true. But if you go into a mall in Saudi Arabia where they're selling Victoria's Secret, the sales clerks are typically foreign men, typically Indians or Pakistanis, who are working in the Victoria's Secret shop. So it always seemed very weird to me that the Saudi men were allowing foreign men to interact with their women in the Victoria's Secret shop. But nonetheless, that's the way it was. And I think it's gradually changing now. I haven't been back to Saudi Arabia in 7 years, so I haven't seen it since then, but I do believe it's changing now. And the other thing that has changed is the Saudis have allowed their women to drive. And that is important because before if they wanted women to be able to go to the grocery store or do errands during the day, they had to hire a driver for them from India or Pakistan or some other country who could drive the women around their cities. And so here are these Saudi men who are very straight-laced about their women, and yet they're letting their women be with foreign men all the time. And so again, that seemed rather strange. And so now that's changed. A year or so ago, Saudi Arabia started to allow women to drive. And so now women can do their own driving. They don't need a driver. And so that is changing many things about the Saudi society. And so we are, human beings are knuckleheads. We're very slow in terms of how we change our attitudes about things, but ultimately we do. And so I'm only using Saudi Arabia as an example that I happen to know personally. But you can see it in many countries where women have been held back and their society is not as far advanced as other societies in general, because they're not using half of their brain power, and that's a silly thing to do. So we are now integrating women, and we're also understanding that nature is important because for example, I'm just hearing on the television this morning about hurricanes that are hitting the Hawaiian Islands and southern Texas. And these hurricanes are getting worse and worse. Our temperatures in the United States are getting worse and worse. When I was a boy, it was very unusual to hear a temperature that was higher than maybe 98 or 100 degrees. But nowadays, it's very, very common to have temperatures in the state of Arizona that approach 115 degrees Fahrenheit and about 45 or 50 degrees Celsius. And that is too hot already. And in a place like Dubai, they commonly have temperatures in the range of 50 or 55 degrees Celsius, which is approaching 150 degrees Fahrenheit, if you can imagine that. So very fast, in a period of a few decades, let's say 3 decades, we've gone from, hot to starting to approach the temperature of boiling water. And so we have to integrate these these needs, or we're just not going to be able to live outside. And if we live inside and depend on air conditioning, it means we're really dependent on air conditioning. And if the temperatures get much hotter and you have a breakdown of your air conditioner, you could very easily die. And so, gradually we're having to integrate these facts into our lives. So going on then, an additional phrase in this sentence: reinterpretation of religious scriptures as poetic and symbolic rather than as purely historical and literal. Okay, so the issue is that the Enlightenment of 500 years ago was really an endarkenment, because before 1500, human beings, thought of God up there and the devil down there and so on. But over the last 500 years with the scientific method, what has happened is that all of these stories that are told in religion are now untrue. They're not true in the physical sense. And And so many people, especially beginning with Friedrich Nietzsche saying God is dead, but he was only reflecting a fact that was believed throughout Europe by that time. If God, in the sense that he was discussed in the Middle Ages, has died or is no longer true, then what do we have? And the problem is that we had 280 million people killed in the 20th century due to violence. And so what needs to be done is, rather than ministers and preachers banging on their Bible and saying, this is fact, this is physical, absolute, literal truth, they need to go back and reinterpret their sacred texts to understand what it was that they did and what they are doing. And so what Dr. Jung observed was that all the major religious systems in the world are actually methods of psychotherapy that evolved naturally over thousands of years. And they were ways for people to deal with mourning and the crises of life, and also the happiness of life, the things like marriage and so on. And, you know, in our ape ancestors, if you ever go to a zoo, you might see a pride of great apes. I think they call it a pride. And there you'll see an alpha male, and there'll be many female apes that are around that alpha male, grooming him, because they all want to be with him, and the non-alpha males are all out on the periphery, and so, you know, we've developed beyond that. We've understood that when there's a fight over what others you can mate with, when that fight exists, then things are not very good in your civilization. You don't have peace in your village. And, you know, if one guy can come and just take your spouse away, that's not good. So human beings invented marriage and monogamous marriage so that we wouldn't fight with one another, among other things. And so that allowed for civilization, but we have to, but anyway, so the religious ideas have to be reinterpreted for modern categories of understanding. It's not that they're not true, they are true in the psyche, as Dr. Jung correctly observed in Answer to Job. Religious statements of whatever kind are statements of the psyche. They are not statements of the physical world. And, you know, fundamentalist religious leaders don't want that secret to come out, because they want you to believe that it's absolutely physically true. And but the reality is that these things are occurring in the psyche. The developments that come through the religious year, for example, the traditions of Christmas, and then a springtime, and then the death of Christ, and at Easter time, and then rebirth, and so on. Those things are celebrated through the Christian year, and they represent the major events of life. This was what Dr. Jung observed. And so the result of that is that human beings over thousands of years were able to see or understand the transformations that go on in a human life, which are substantial, we're able to see them in the context of religion. But now we have had so many scientific facts come to light over the last 500 years that it's very hard to believe the things that you hear in a church service, except as a metaphor, except as a way of kind of understanding what's really going on within you. And you may be understanding it at an unconscious level, which is fine. That's fine. But for those who need to understand at a conscious level, then the scriptures need to be reinterpreted for modern categories of understanding, which is quite possible, but it's a task that has to be picked up. And it's a task that has to be picked up in every religion of the world. So that's the point of that phrase. And so then the last phrase is reinterpretation of the figure of Christ as a symbolic expression of the inner dynamics of the soul. So in this case, as Dr. Jung pointed out in a book called Ion, Christ represents the deepest part of the archetypal part of everyone's psyche. And so what he was, the question is, what are you called to do? What was Christ called to do? Well, Christ was called to change the way the Western world thought about religion. And nobody really knows how he was educated. Many people think that he went to India he was gone for 18 years. We don't know what happened to Christ from age 12 to age 30. And so during that period, many people think that he went to India and he studied in Hindu and Buddhist environments. And there are even monasteries in India which claim that Christ was there. And we don't know for sure. But what we do know is that we don't know what happened to him during that 18-year period. But when he came back and started to go around and teach, he was teaching a different perspective about the world to everyone. And so, I can give you a couple of examples from Christian myth about miracles performed by Christ that might help you see what I mean. Okay, so one example is Lazarus. Christ is reputed to have brought Lazarus back to life. And Lazarus was a friend of Christ's, as were his sister and mother, I believe. And so when Lazarus died, Christ was asked to come in. And when he left the house afterward, it's reputed that Lazarus was alive. Well, the question is, was that a physical fact or was it a spiritual fact? And it's quite possible, and in my view, probable, that what Christ did was he went into the house and he told, I think the two women are called Martha, he told the Marthas that Lazarus would continue to live, but he would live in their heart. And, I can say from my own personal experience of having lost my brother and my parents, that all of them are still alive for me very much. And actually, all of our ancestors are still alive, if you think about it. Because every one of us, every human being, has ancestors that go back to single-celled organisms. So from single-celled organisms onward, and probably before that, every ancestor in our lineage has done two things successfully. They survived until they reproduced. They survived until they reproduced. So that those two cells, the sperm and the egg, got together. And this happened for all of us, actually, because all of us come from the same origin. But ultimately, going way back, there were two cells. And also in our lives, there were two cells, a sperm and an egg. And they got together and they reproduced and created other cells. And so it is for all of our ancestors. They ultimately created living beings in the physical world. And those living beings did two things. They survived until they reproduced. And so coming forward now through millions of sets of ancestors, you might not want to think about the fact that 100,000 generations back, your ancestors were amphibians or they were fish or whatever, but nonetheless, they were. and that's the scientific fact today. And so, so in the case of Christ now, there is a part of us that drives us to do things. And Dr. Jung and Dr. Edinger after him called that the God image. They also called it the greater personality. So the way I can describe that is you don't know what you're going to be doing 2 minutes from now. Okay, what will drive you 2 minutes from now is not in your control. Okay, something can suddenly happen in your building. It can catch fire, or an earthquake could happen, or any number of things, and you will be driven by your instinct to do certain things in that circumstance. Maybe you'll still be sitting here listening to me, but you can't predict that. And so there's a part of you that really controls you. And that part, in Jungian psychology, we call the God image, or the greater personality, or the self. And so each of us, when things happen to us, I've had many bad things happen to me in my lifetime, but it's always myself that looks at the options of what I could do next, and that self tells me what to do next. Okay, and it might not be something I planned. For example, when I went to law school, I didn't plan to be making videos about Carl Jung's work 50 years later. 50 years ago, I was in law school, and it was not anywhere near my mind that I would be 50 years later teaching psychology. But because of various things that happened in my life, various traumatic events, one thing led to another, and here I am. And sorry, I have to eat some honey or something. And so the point about Christ as a figure, is he represents that part of us. So we have found, he found that he was the Son of God, and he lived that truth completely. That was his calling. And there was only one time that he broke from that during his preaching period, and that was when he was on the cross and he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Then he was speaking from his human side, not his God image side or his God side. But he knew what he was doing. He knew that he had to be an example in order for people to change. And part of being that example was that he had to die. And he knew that. And so he willingly accepted that lot. Okay, now, for each of us, we also have a calling. We are called to do something. We are called to be a parent, for example, or we're called to be a doctor, a lawyer, an Indian chief, a policeman, a fireman, you name it, whatever it is that is what draws us to our vocation or our life. That's the self. And so, the one famous example that is not too controversial is the biological clock in women, which is women go through a time when they can have children, and then that period ends and they can no longer have children. And so many women who think that they can have a career as a lawyer, let's say, or something else, change their minds in midlife and go have children, because the biological clock, the so-called biological clock, says to them, you should have a baby. And so for women, that biological clock is unstoppable, and that's the self telling you that you should have a baby. And it doesn't mean that you have to, but if you don't, then there are going to be consequences for yourself, which can cause depression sometimes, and you have to have an alternative approach. So, for example, my current wife, who's I've been married to for 35 years, but she's not the mother of my children, and she's never had a child, but she had, that urge to have a child, she has taken out on having pet dogs. And so for 15 years, we had pet dogs, and those pet dogs, we loved them dearly. We loved them like children. But, and so for her mothering instinct was able to be played out with those dogs. But it has to happen somehow. And because this is the way we are as human beings. So for her, she never had physical children, but she did still have this urge, this feminine urge to have children to care for, let's say. And so she could do that. And so for all of us, Christ represents a calling that we have to see through. So my current calling, which has been manifesting for many years, is to teach psychology and to have other people understand what Dr. Jung was saying in his work, because it's been hidden. And so that's why this YouTube channel now has 9,700 followers, because people are looking for the truth and how our psychology actually works. And other solutions haven't worked as well. For example, during the 20th century, the Freudian approach to psychology has been in the ascendancy, and that approach is rationalistic and materialistic. And so it suggests that you'll be happy if you get some prize, like a boat or something like that. But the problem is it's never enough. And because the two best days of having a boat are the day you get it and the day you get rid of it. And in between those 2 days, your boat is a hole in the water into which you pour money. And so unless you're out on your boat doing something in your boat, it doesn't do much for you. Whereas a child can support you in your later years, for example. And the other problem is that Freudian psychology relies on statistics. So if you go into a psychologist's office and you are depressed, the Freudian psychologist will say, oh, okay, you're depressed, here's a drug. Well, the problem with that now, after decades of it, is that we have a very large percentage of our population addicted to drugs. And I think it was 2017, I haven't looked at the recent statistics, but in 2017, we had 72,000 people in the United States alone who died from overdoses of drugs. And even psychologists who know better and know these facts, the great example is Jordan Peterson, who was given drugs for a depression that he had. And the result was he became terribly addicted to those drugs. It almost killed him. And fortunately, his family had the money to support saving his life. And so it seems like he's now on the mend, but it was a very close thing. And so we have to be very careful when somebody wants to give you drugs for something. And for example, I've had my knee and my ankle replaced, which are very major surgeries, and they require 8 weeks of convalescence before you can even really walk again. But in both cases, I took the narcotic painkiller only one day, because I'm so worried about getting addicted to the drugs. And as a result, after that first day, I just switched to just normal ibuprofen and Tylenol, and it worked well enough so that I didn't have to have the narcotic anymore. And so, we should all be very worried about when a doctor wants to prescribe narcotics to us. And on the other hand, a Jungian psychologist, it takes longer, it takes an effort to get to the bottom of what's really bothering you, so that you can then be reconstructed in a way that you can understand it consciously and therefore heal yourself, basically. And that's what Jungian psychology does. And that's what I like, why I like it so much, because I've been reading Dr. Jung's work for 33 years. And, you know, I've been through some tough times in those 33 years. And he has always helped me find myself. And so that's why I'm so committed to his work today, and what I'm trying to explain to you. So with Christ as a symbol, for example, he's a symbol for the self. That self tells you what you are called to. In my case, I'm called to be doing this lecture right now. But I've been called to many things in my career. I've served in the U.S. Marine Corps to Lieutenant Colonel. I've been a practicing lawyer for 5 years. I have an MBA. I became a business executive and I founded a company that became public. So I've done many, many things over my career, but I've also had many tragedies over my career. And so then when something like that happens, you have to be able to rebuild yourself and move on, even if what you do is quite different from what you originally thought. I mean, I originally thought I would serve in the Marine Corps, but when I was a lieutenant colonel, I slipped on the ice and broke my leg, and that was the end of my career. And so then there was no going on as a Marine. I had to figure out what I was going to do next. And so that's a process. And each time there's a need to rebuild, you have to have a foundation upon which you can rebuild. And so in Christ's case, he left at age 12, came back at age 30. He had learned a lot of things wherever he was, because when he began to teach during his ministry, he taught profound things that nobody had thought about. Okay, I said I'd give another example. Another example is when he cured the blind man. And the blind man was cured and was brought to the Pharisees, and they didn't believe that the man could see. And the man said absolutely that he could see. Now, what did he see? What Christ taught him was that he could see the purpose and meaning of his life, which, among other things, is that he's immortal because we're still telling his story 2,000 years later. And so he could see certain aspects of the meaning of his life that he could see inwardly. He may not have seen it in the physical world, but in the spiritual world, he definitely could see. And the Pharisees, who were the preachers of that day, the ministers or the rabbis, they didn't understand that. Because he couldn't physically see, probably, but he could see the meaning of his life, the purpose of his life, what he represented to everyone since the year zero in the Western calendar. And so that blind man is immortal, just as Christ is immortal in the same sense. And his spirit and his reality, that's a miracle, no doubt. And it's the same thing with someone who dies, like Lazarus. You know, you may not have experienced a death of someone close to you yet, but you will, because all of our parents die, we die, and what we have to understand is that their physical body may not be around anymore, but they are with you every bit as much after their death as they were before their death. So my brother died 32 years ago, and yet I feel him in me right now. He's immortal in the sense that I'm telling his story right now. And so he's not dead in that sense. And the same is true of my parents, my father and my mother. And if you've lost a parent, you will know also that those people are still alive for you. You know, they're not alive in the physical sense. Yes, I grant that. But, you know, and this is why Dr. Jung always was referring back to medieval practices. For example, in medieval monasteries, the monks would greet each other each morning with the words memento mori, which means remember death. And the point is that death is pretty much the same for all beings. You know, your physical body is either going to be burned to ashes in a cremation, or it's going to be put in a box and it will rot in a box for the next 1,000 years. It's your choice. But in either case, your physical body isn't going to be immortal. It's going to change and be recycled like everything else on the planet. And in one way or another, either, you know, E equals mc squared. So if it's matter right now, and you're cremated, it becomes matter, becomes energy, and so it begets heat in that case. And so the point is that heaven is in a different place, and immortality is in a different place from the way we've been taught it in Sunday school. And the point is, you know, for example, Dr. Jung left us 20 volumes of his collected works, actually much more, but it hasn't all been published as yet. But he knew what he had done. He knew he was called to do that, and he left that legacy. And so he's still alive today, even though his physical body died 59 years ago. His spirit is still here in this conversation, and we need to understand that. And you see the building behind me. This is a building that Dr. Jung built with his bare hands as a testimony to what he knew about life, that, you know, he knew that this would be a monument to his spirit during his lifetime, because he created it, and he lived in it, and it gave him connection back to his soul, and so he called it his testimony in stone. And so if you look at the videos on this YouTube channel, you'll find that there are now over 1,100 videos that I've put here since June the 1st of 2016. And those 1,100 videos are my testimony to to my spirit, not only my spirit, but the spirit of C.G. Jung as well. And so that's why we have to memento mori. We have to remember death, because once death comes, then we either become ashes, our physical body becomes ashes, or a bunch of meat rotting in a box. And so if we're going to be immortal in any way, then it has to be from the works that we accomplish in our lifetime. And so that's why the monks would say memento mori, because they were doing something. They were handwriting copies of the Bible and illuminating copies of the Bible, many of them in their monasteries. And that was a reflection of their spirit. And the fact that we have those documents today is a testimony to their immortality and their spirit. So anyway, so Christ represents, metaphorically, he represents all of us. It's not that you and I are going to go out and challenge somebody and get ourselves nailed to a cross, but I've certainly been nailed to a couple of crosses, I can tell you, in my lifetime. And it's because I had to see this or that through. And so Christ was giving us his example of how to live, which is to understand what we're called to do and to do it, no matter what the cost, including your life. And sometimes, people give their lives. I recently published a video about Kyle Carpenter, who was a U.S. Marine who jumped on a hand grenade in Afghanistan. And so he was awarded, he survived, but he was terribly injured. He lost his right eye, I believe. And he was terribly injured. And but he's a beautiful human being. And he saw his mission through. And when he jumped on that hand grenade, that was his self causing him to do that. It wasn't his everyday physical ego, because his everyday physical ego would have said, no, don't do that. But his self told him that the only way one of the two of them that was on that roof that night would survive is if he jumped on that hand grenade. And as a result, he saved his partner on the roof, and he was lucky enough to survive it. And so that's why he won the Congressional Medal of Honor, because he did what he was called to do. And so that's what we all have to do in our lives. If you're called to teach 1,000 kindergartners in your lifetime, then that's a contribution to the world. And that's major. And your contribution to that person is going to carry through 1,000 lives. And so that surely is immortality. And I had a kindergarten teacher named Miss Brown. She was a beautiful young woman. When I was 4 and 5 years old, and I still remember her, and I still remember her kindness and her dedication to me and the other children in my kindergarten class very clearly. And so her contribution to my life lives still. I have no idea what happened to her after that, because my family moved to a different city after that. But I still remember her name, and I have many memories, happy memories of what she did to educate me as a 4 and 5 year old child. So those contributions are just as important as anybody else's contributions. And so, you know, you need to listen to yourself, your internal greater personality, and see what it is you're going to do today. And if you're stopped from doing that, then you need to do it again and find another thing. And, you know, so I have gone through many phases of that, probably 10 major ones in my lifetime now. And that's what we do. And that's why Christ is a symbol of what we all must do in our lifetime, which is to live what we're called to do. All right, so going on now. So we've gotten through about 3 sentences here. Let me go on to the next sentence of this essay. At this point, it seems clear that under postmodern conditions, only one path forward seems possible, remains passable. If we have, I'm sorry, my vision is now failing me, so I may have to get others to read for me in the future. So I'll read that sentence again. At this point, it seems clear that under postmodern conditions, only one path forward remains passable. If we have interpreted the signs of our time correctly, the metamorphosis of the gods will require the individual's utmost commitment to an ongoing process for which Jung proposed the term individuation. So what he's saying here, the metamorphosis of the gods, is to understand that it's not some creature out there in space that's pulling your strings. It's something within you. Christ is within you, or God is within you, or you don't have to call it Christ or God, but you can call it just the self, this greater personality that Dr. Edinger talked about, which is that part of you that causes you to be you. And so the gods have changed from being a puppeteer out there to being a force that's within you that you need to recognize and follow. Whether you call it a god or not, that's what it is. And so what Dr. Jung observed is that there is a religious element to our nature. And if you understand that and understand also the evil that is within you, then you can be a better person. And that's called individuation. That's not individuality. That's not just, oh, I want to be the school president, or I want to be a fireman. It's not that kind of individuality at all. It's individuation means understanding all people, understanding that everybody is going through exactly the same process as you internally, and understanding their trouble as well as your own. Then you might individuate. And if you can't do that, then you're not going to make a very important contribution in your life. So you need to examine yourself, know yourself, and know what it is that you can contribute. Even if that thing today is something very small, it could be, soothing a quiet child or a crying child, for example. That can be something that child would remember forever, and remember you forever, for example. And so it's very simple that's what needs to be done. And that's why in the United States we have this bumper sticker, which is think globally but act locally. And it means that we as human beings have to understand we're in this context of one world, and one species, and we're not going to get out of that. And so we have to be cognizant of that fact, and we have to teach all of our grandchildren to be able to understand that fact. But at the same time, we can only do what we can do in our place where we live. And so I can do this. I can talk to you this morning. But I can't do more. I can't help you find a job or give you a job or any other such thing. And so that task you have to find within yourself to find the answer. And so I can only point the way. I can offer a guidepost, but I can't solve everyone's problems. That's we each have to solve our own problems. And I know I solve at least 100 problems a day. From the moment I wake up to the moment I go to sleep, I'm solving various problems in one way or another. And that's what we are. We're problem-solving creatures. So, okay, so that's what individuation is about in part. And so then the narrative for this contained in the Red Book, and with it begins Jung's new myth, showing the way of what is to come. Okay, so what he's talking about is the way of what is to come is for all of us to individuate and to recognize that it's we that have to ultimately develop ourselves. If you're living someone else's rules and someone else's rituals and so on, you're living someone else's life too. And so you have to study yourself internally to determine what it is that you can contribute to the world, and only you can say that. And so, I guess I'll close this discussion this morning by going back once again to what Dr. Jung said at the end of his life. And there, Man and His Symbols is the book by C.G. Jung. And so this is an essay that he wrote only 10 days before his death. And so it represents his heartfelt sort of summation of everything that he thought. And so if you think your life is not satisfactory for some reason, then you should analyze within yourself what makes it unsatisfactory, and then determine what it is that you can do to change that situation. We all have to do that. And so this is how Dr. Jung put it on page 101 of Man and His Symbols. As any change must begin somewhere, it is the single individual who will experience it and carry it through. The change must indeed begin with an individual. It might be any one of us. Nobody can afford to look around and to wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself. But since nobody seems to know what to do, it might be worthwhile for each of us to ask himself whether by any chance his or her unconscious may know something that will help us. Certainly the conscious mind seems unable to do anything useful in this respect. Man today is painfully aware of the fact that neither his great religions nor his various philosophies seem to provide him with those powerful, animating ideas that would give him the security he needs in the face of the present condition of the world. So in my case, for a long while, I was resistant about the fact that Jungian analysts, the Jungian analyst community, doesn't teach Jungian psychology to laymen, to the rest of the world. They have a profession, they teach it to their clients, and they charge them $150 an hour to teach them and to help them see what Dr. Jung saw. But they never, in my view, from my perception until at least the 80s, there were very few of them that were trying to help average people understand. And even Dr. Jung himself had a very small cadre of people around him, only a couple of dozen, who listened to his lectures all through the 20s and 30s. And he never broadcast them. He gave them, and fortunately we have records of those lectures, so now we have them to refer back to. But he worked locally, basically. He became quite famous because he was finding important things, and so very wealthy people would come to him. But you know, he basically worked locally, and he saw that what he could do was to write down his perceptions about, particularly about religion, and he did that. And so it came to me that I couldn't wait around for the Jungian analyst community to start talking to average people like you and me. And so I decided long ago, back in 2010, I started the Archetype in Action website. And before that, I had written a book. And so all those things are things that my psyche told me to do, myself told me to do. And I'm still doing it, and I'm not waiting for others to do it. By the way, this afternoon, we have a conference with Ann Belford Ulanoff, who's one of the most amazing individuals I've ever experienced in my lifetime. She is Professor Emerita of Psychiatry and Religion at Union Theological Seminary, and she will be speaking to our group this afternoon at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. Unfortunately, in Asia, that's about 1 o'clock in the morning for you, but nonetheless, it's going to be a very important conversation, and so I urge you to listen to it. It will be broadcast in a live stream on YouTube. And if you wish to be a panelist and participate in that conversation, please write to me at skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will get you the information you need so that you can join the Zoom panel. But the conversation will be available here on YouTube as well, and I urge you to come and tune into it this afternoon. Now, so I've now talked for an hour and a half, and I've gone through exactly one paragraph, which is about 2/3 of a page of Dr. Arzt's essay. This is why I say that Dr. Arzt's essay is truly profound, and this is why I've been talking about it for 4 weeks now, and I'm going to continue doing that for the audience, especially that I'm trying to reach, which is an audience that doesn't have access to YouTube. Yeah, they don't have access to YouTube. They do have access to listening live on Zoom, and so that's why I'm doing this at 8 o'clock in the morning on Sunday mornings. And so I hope you'll join me again next Sunday, and I will continue on with the essay. So we will continue next Sunday with page 22, and there are 39 pages in this essay. But I think you see why I think this essay is so profound, because every phrase in every sentence is so meaningful. And if you want to listen to the entire essay, it is in 2 parts, part 1 and part 2, on the homepage of the YouTube channel under the playlist Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul under Postmodern Conditions. And so that's what I've been working with today. This is the book, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul under Postmodern Conditions by Mary Stein and Thomas Arzt. This is volume 1, but there are now 4 volumes of this series, and all or most of these essays in this series are truly profound, and I urge you to buy volume 1 and then the other volumes in turn, and then you can see Dr. Arzt's essay in its totality. I'm only talking through it, but I did read his entire essay right out without discussion, and as I said, you can find that reading on the homepage of this YouTube channel. So, Emily, thank you for joining me and pushing me along on Zoom today, and we've had 8 or 10 people watching live on YouTube today. And usually when I have that many people on YouTube through a 2-hour period, it usually means that maybe as many as 100 people have watched all or a part of this stream live. And after we close this out, it will be available on YouTube for viewing. And so for others who are in countries that don't restrict YouTube, you will be able to watch it again if you want to. So thank you very much for being here. And I'm going to terminate the conversation at this time because my voice is failing me and I have to host Dr. Ulanoff this afternoon. And so I hope you can join us again then. Bye-bye.